So I'll begin. I'm Ted Koskores, head of school at Thayer Academy. I want to welcome all of you. This is our fifth webinar speaker series program. We commenced last March at the beginning of the COVID period, and we've had since that time almost 1,000 viewers who've joined us from around the country. So we're deeply appreciative that all of you are here this evening, and we're looking forward to this program featuring Alegría de la Cruz, alumna from the class of 1993. I just wanted to share with you very, very briefly some of the things that are going on at Thayer Academy as we speak. The Academy, of course, has been dealing with the two large themes which have infused our nation with purpose and affected our lives in deep and profound ways. Since March of last year, we have been dealing with the COVID pandemic, and the school has been adapting well to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. This fall, we opened up with our middle schoolers coming back each and every day, and our upper schoolers come back to school every other day. In those days when they're not at school, they're typically zooming into classes or doing work independently. It's been wonderful to see our kids back on campus. It's a vivid reminder of why we are educators, to see them communing with one another again, to see them taking joy in the participation in the life of a community is very heartwarming indeed. It's great to see them too, as they're beginning to participate in athletics after the school day ends, and they're beginning to scrimmage with some of the neighboring schools, all in accordance with state regulations and complying with all the COVID concerns that we continue to have at school. Additionally, of course, the school has been deeply impacted by the challenge the broader nation faces in promoting a more diverse and inclusive society. We at Thayer have taken this responsibility very seriously. We recognize that there have been things that we have done and not done in the past, which have been less than ideal for all our students, and we are committed to paving the way to make sure each and every one of our students enjoys the full benefit of the mission of Thayer Academy. And we've devoted considerable resources to that endeavor in terms of promoting new programs within our curriculum, promoting the importance of anti-racism, and providing to our students more of a historical context for the evolution of racism and systemic systems in our country, which have denied opportunities to some of our population over time. So these are important endeavors that our school is facing, and again, reflective of the concerns that our entire nation must address and must successfully overcome. Tonight's program, of course, is going to be directed to the energies and a sense of purpose of one of our esteemed alumna. But I do want to introduce our two former faculty members who will be interviewing Alegría over the course of the evening. First, we have Norma Atkinson, who taught at Thayer for 32 years. She was chair of the history department, taught history. She retired in 2014, and throughout her career at Thayer, she really created an environment within her classrooms and within the other activities that she supported of causing our students to really reflect deeply about the learning process and to encourage them to deepen their own appreciation for the evolution of our nation, and to really embrace the unique opportunity in their life to come to grips with who we are as a people and to become active participants in shaping our society moving forward. She's also the proud grandparent of 3 Thayer alums. Jim King taught at Thayer 40 years and retired just very recently in 2020. Jim was a English teacher, well-regarded, highly esteemed. He was involved in an array of community service projects, and really in his passion for teaching English and talking about the motivations of the human spirit and how people really address the opportunities in their lives, and his fusion of that with his own commitment to community service and reaching out to other people who are less advantaged than he was and some of our students. He really embodied the mission of Thayer Academy and really changed a lot of people's lives over the course of his teaching career at Thayer Academy. Jim is the proud parent of 3 Thayer graduates, and what is common to both Norma and Jim is really this sense of deep, passionate purpose in helping young people grow and aspire to become active citizens in the world in which they live. And we're delighted to have both of them here this evening, and they'll lead us through the rest of our program. So with all that said, let me turn it over to Jim and to Norma. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ted. And thanks to everyone else who's worked so hard to make this event possible. It's wonderful to be with you tonight. It's particularly gratifying to have a former student return to teach us something. Teachers always like that. Alegría graduated from Thayer in 1993 and is remembered as an outstanding student and athlete. I'm sure I saw her play lacrosse. I probably didn't know what she was doing, but I probably understood that she was doing it very well because she did everything very well. But I remember her personally as a student and as an outstanding student. She's the kind of student that teachers love to have in the classroom. She came to every discussion with an open mind and an inquiring mind. She did not settle for easy answers. She had a healthy dose of skepticism, and she always asked why. And I'm sure she continues to do that in everything that she does today. She was a very good athlete. There's no question about that. She was a varsity lacrosse player, a two-time All-American. Her team won championships both her junior and senior year. And in recognition of her talent, she was awarded the Nancy Di Natale Prize at graduation as the outstanding female athlete in her class at Thayer. She became a member of the Thayer Hall of Fame in 2013. She then went on to Yale, where she majored in history and where she continued to be an outstanding student and a dominant athlete in Division I women's lacrosse. Next came University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where she earned her law degree in 2003. Alegría has worked in public service and public interest for the state of California at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, and at the Rural Legal Assistance Office. Last month, she was appointed to serve as the first director of the Sonoma County Office of Equity. In this role, she will be addressing racial disparities in health, wealth, and well-being of the people in her community. She is also the newest trustee on the Santa Cruz School Board. In addition to dealing with issues presented by the COVID pandemic, Alegría has also had to face the ravages of the glass fire in Sonoma County. So we are looking forward to talking to her about how she is doing and how her community is doing. And now I think Jim has a few things he'd like to say.
Yes, again, hello everyone, and thanks for coming. I'll start with a little note that Steve Branfman, our renowned pottery teacher, sent me and asked me to read about his former student, Alegría. Alegría was a dedicated pottery student. Her interest was not only in learning the skills and techniques necessary to craft objects, but extended to wanting to understand and grasp the difference between the mass-produced and the handmade object. And the value, importance, and relevance of handmade objects in the 20th century. She always expressed a sensitivity, kindness, and humanity that was palpable at an age so unusual to do so. I'll always remember her for that. The pride I have in her for what she has devoted her life to, has accomplished, and what the future holds for her in her new position is overwhelming. So that's, again, Steve Branfman, our beloved pottery teacher. In my own sake, I'd like to say that one of the pleasures of being an English teacher is we get to listen to students process all kinds of stories in fiction and poetry and drama, even in essays and so on. And it's interesting, of course, to see who emerges as those with impressive intellectual ability, but also important and gratifying to see those who really have the emotional intelligence to relate to characters and whatever they're going through. And if you can empathize with the characters in a fictional story, what you're also doing, of course, is empathizing with the writer, the author, and the deep philosophical questions that person has tried to pose, the dilemmas in life that writer is offering to us to consider, so that in our own lives, we may become better able to cope with all the struggles that we encounter along the way. And Alegría was certainly among the very best in this regard. You know, that's something I will remember. She added a richness to discussions in a way that every English teacher hopes students will be able to step up and do. She really seemed to get it, both on the level of the story and to get it beyond the story in terms of what a writer was urging us to challenge ourselves by thinking about. Another thrill that has become more clear to me in recent years is, you know, the pleasure that we get, all teachers in all disciplines get this thrill when we get a chance to watch years later one of our former students in the process of using her intelligence and putting together all the knowledge that she's gathered along the way to begin to write her own life. So we're very excited to have Alegría here tonight to talk about the career in which she has managed to write so much of her own story. And we're at this point, we are ready to welcome her. But first, let me say, just for your own information in the audience, there is a question and answer feature that you're invited to use throughout the evening. And I will try to field some of those with the help of a few people from the alumni office behind the scenes, the real brains of the outfit. And one other thing, please be aware that the event is being recorded so that it will be available later to watch. So it's with great pleasure we welcome Alegría and look forward to all she has to tell us. And Norma,
thank you so much for a beautiful introduction. I didn't think I was already going to get weepy at this point of the night, so thank you so much for all of your kind words. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so excited to be in your presence again.
Okay, with that, I think I'll ask the first question. While you were at Thayer, we were aware that your family was involved with the United Farm Workers movement, but most of us had no idea about how involved they were. You really come from a family of activists. Your parents and grandparents were heavily involved in the struggle to organize farm workers. And I wondered if you could tell us a little about the work they did and the people with whom they came in contact. And if you could also describe the circumstances of your birth, which I think really proves that you were born to be an activist. And also, if you could tell us how this California girl ended up in Boston and at Thayer Academy. Now, I know that that's a lot in there, but I will remind you of some of it as we go along.
Okay. So let's see. My mom and dad met. No, I'm gonna start with my grandma because she's the one who really gets the credit. So my grandmother, Jessie Lopez de la Cruz, was one of the first women organizers in the fields in the early 60s in California, organizing farm workers, going door to door, household by household, family by family, organizing the first successful union for farm workers in the history of the United States. She was the mother of 6, and my dad was her youngest. And he used to laugh that there was only a few ways to leave California Central Valley if you were a farm worker kid, or there were only a few options for your life. And so he said there was either drugs, Jesus, or the Navy. And so my dad chose the Navy to escape California Central Valley and was actually serving in Vietnam when he came home. And like many other vets, was really devastated, both by his experience and, as you know, in Vietnam, what he experienced when he came home from Vietnam. And he saw his mom just in this movement that gave her so much life, and really kind of laid out a different future for so many of the kids that he grew up with, for what he saw as possible in his own life. And so after coming home from Vietnam, he joined his mom in that movement, organizing. And he met my mom organizing. My mom was 17 years old and a little white girl from Long Beach, California, who went to a semester of the University of California at Irvine. And, you know, in the height of the 1960s was pretty almost immediately politicized, and was introduced to the farm workers movement and finished one semester and went to organize farm workers and never looked back. And so they met in that effort, in that movement, and they had 4 kids, and I'm their oldest. And so I was actually born in Delano, California, which is the headquarters of the farm workers movement. It was home base for much of the organizing, for all of the political strategizing, for much of the marching, and so much of the activism that the union is famous for. But what folks don't know about the 40 acres in particular that I think is such a special part of that history is that so much of the UFW was actually pushed into existence by a small group of very militant, amazing Filipino organizers. And the Filipinos in the fields of California were some of the earliest guest workers, right? Folks who came across into California to work in the fields. And they were incredibly organized, incredibly militant, had a very tight community. And because of anti-miscegenation laws at the time, had no ability to bring their own families across. They didn't have the resources to do that, and weren't allowed to remarry and to have their own families as men in California. And so as they started to age and need additional care and resources, the union built a little village in the 40 acres that had kind of a small assortment of houses, of rooms kind of around a central courtyard next to a clinic that was also for their care, as well as other farm workers who were part of the union. And so my mom, the story goes, was hugely pregnant and was finishing off 33 straight elections in the tomato harvests when she was kind of summoned down to Delano to chill out for a little while and have her baby. And so she moved down into the Agbayani village, and she talks about kind of the weeks before my birth as just being surrounded by this group of men who had not been able to be around their own families and to have their own families, and who were just so thrilled at being part of bringing a baby into the world. And so she kind of, you know, fit into one of those little homes for the time before my birth. And that's where I was born, is at the farm worker clinic at the 40 acres, surrounded by this incredible group of men who are in many ways forgotten as the true kind of drivers of the farm workers movement and that militancy in that first strike in 1965. So that's where I was born. And my family moved 15 times in the first 11 years of my life, all up and down California, organizing in different campaigns. We moved to Texas for a couple of months, to Montreal, Canada for a couple of months. And so we were migrants in the same way that the communities that we were organizing were, because we really lived their lives and were part of what it was that the struggles were that they were facing and organizing around. And we ended up in Boston in 1986 because at that time in California, we had Reagan was president and George Deukmejian was our governor. And that combination was nearly fatal to any political organizing that the union was able to do in California at the time. And so the union organized, you know, families who were leaders in the union to move across the country to kind of set up shop in different cities to organize those labor movements in support of the UFW. And so, you know, there were a couple of choices that were thrown out to folks who were ready to pick up and move across the country to different cities. And when Boston was one of those choices, my mom threw up her hand. It's like, we're going somewhere. We're gonna get out of California. We're gonna see how this is. And so in 1986, after growing up kind of on the road as a farm worker organizer kid in dusty farm worker towns across California and little stints here and there, we ended up in Milton, Massachusetts. And I don't think I need to tell you kind of what the culture shock was like for me. And then how much that was even increased when I landed at Thayer Academy in 1988 as an 8th grader. So that's a little bit about how I ended up at Thayer, and you know, is so blessed to be your student and the student of Branf and Mr. Rooney and so many other people that I just remember so deeply and so well in my heart as a lifelong student.
Thank you.
Alegría, do you think, could you please tell us a little bit about your law school experience and some of your early experiences when you actually began your legal career, and maybe to give it a little insight into how your background with your parents' activism with the farm workers continued to inform your worldview and your activism.
Sure. So, I think in every place, in every institution that I found myself, what my parents did and how they moved through the world and how they brought this pride in what it is that we did. It was also such a small community that we lived in and that we were part of. And so it was special. I don't think a lot of folks knew that as a union organizer, you made $5 a week. And so that's what we lived on. I remember applying to college and having college application being like, you're missing some zeros on your application. And I was like, no, man, that's my parents' income for, whatever, 1992. And so it really was this, this very alternative way of moving through the world. And with that came, just a deep sense of pride in who we were and a sense of pride in the responsibility that I felt for being part of that movement and part of having that be my family. And so I think about, every place that I came into, it was important for me. I think once I finally felt like I had the language to even articulate what my life was like and how different it was from kids who were around me on a regular basis, it really stepped into that space of saying, like, what is it that's special about the education and the experience that I've been given that comes with a responsibility? And so, at Yale, I was an organizer and we got grapes removed from all the campuses and all the dining halls. And when it came time to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life in grad school, I chose law school. And I chose to come back to California for law school because California had just ended affirmative action, frankly. And I wanted to be part of that movement of really fighting for what I felt was a right to higher education that students of color in California had, and how important it was at that moment for us to really lift our voices up and start to push back against what was happening at campuses all throughout California. And so when I came into law school in the fall of 2000, at that point, every single class that was present at the University of California, Berkeley, had no longer been admitted under affirmative action. And if you look at kind of the two flagship schools in the University of California system, what that did to the enrollment of students of color in those two top schools was devastating. So the law school at the University of California, right, the premier flagship law school to train future lawyers to represent Californians, was a class of 300. And out of that class of 300, there was one African-American man, there were 5 African-American women, and I think there were 12 Latinos, but only 6 of us who were like, hey, I'm here, I'm loud, I'm proud, and I'm going to do something about it. And so we found each other in this place that had been really decimated and had this really kind of like sad pall over the entire campus. I think that a lot of progressive faculty, a lot of administrators throughout the entire system felt that they had failed in not being able to stop this, this kind of train that was moving through public education, and not just in California. We learned as we started organizing that this was a movement that was happening in other states as well, as part of this effort to kind of roll back those gains that the civil rights movement had been able to achieve, and to use colorblindness as an argument that, using race as a form of restoring past harms, of really looking at how you address deep injustices that communities of color have faced in the United States, was such a critical tool for being able to say, these are the kids who have a right to be here. And we have a responsibility to make sure that they're there, because we have to right that harm that we've caused through our history and through our systems and the ways in which we've denied them presence in those places in the past. And so in my classes, there were, huge law, auditoriums where there were very, very few students of color actually engaging in very critical questions of jurisprudence that impacted us in our communities in some ways more than any others. And so we were very frustrated with this education. That was not what we came to law school to learn or to be taught. And so we started organizing, and we started organizing around specifically a case that was happening at the University of Michigan. And this case was really special for students because it was the first time in the history of this kind of area of jurisprudence around affirmative action challenges and the development of the use of, reverse discrimination, which FYI doesn't exist, to really kind of unseat affirmative action and the gains it had achieved for students of color. And the Michigan case was special because it was the first time that students of color had been able to achieve intervener status in a case. And to prove that you have intervener status, you have to be able to show that you have a different interest than the ones that the parties are already bringing forward. So the University of Michigan's interest in this case was to say, it's important for the kind of, the overall quality of our education that we are able to provide to students, that students of color are here, right? They give a deeper education to all students by being here. So that's our interest is in this kind of diversity interest, that diversity is good for all students. And the students of color at Michigan said, actually, we're not here to educate other people or to make their experiences richer. We're here because we have a right to higher education. And we're here to make sure that we protect that right. And so the court in the Michigan cases basically said, we're going to acknowledge that students of color have a different interest. And that moved so many of us across the country to see the ways in which the court had actually recognized that we had a different interest in this conversation. And so we spent our 3 years in law school, not necessarily going to black letter law classes and being fed what had created the situation in the first place, but writing amicus briefs and organizing protests in our own classrooms, in our own institutions to increase the hiring of students of faculty of color, of increasing ways to increase admissions of students of color, even in the face of this ban on affirmative action and hiring and admissions. And so I really, all of that work is, I tie it back to the responsibility and the pride that I feel that comes from, what my grandma started. And on a pretty regular basis, all throughout law school, my grandma would call and be like, what are you doing now? Tell me all about it. What's the hell that you're raising? Who's organizing? And she wanted to be in the middle of all of that strategy. And so it's with such love and such pride that, I continue to do that work. But that was, that's what taught me. Those experiences in law school are what really taught me to be the kind of lawyer that I wanted to become, and that I wanted my education to teach me and to give me those skills to be that kind of lawyer. And so I really, I feel like with each iteration of my experiences in different institutions, like as you kind of grow and develop that language and that pride and that sense of being able to say, this is what makes me different. This is what, these are my, these are my superpowers. These are my skill sets that come from my history. That was another place where I was like, okay, this is where I really want to be right now is, in this place that has taken all these steps to make sure that we're invisible and that we have no place and that we're silenced, to say, no, sorry, guess what? You let me in. So we're going to make sure that we take that space and that we continue to raise our voices and elevate that visibility of how critical it is for all students to be educated in all places.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think your grandmother would have been proud of you making good trouble.
Exactly.
I have a question that I'd like to ask you. Your work in helping the underserved in your community has been made more urgent by the COVID pandemic and by the glass fire in Sonoma County. Can you tell us how you and your family are coping, first of all? And then can you describe what conditions are like for essential workers and how you see your role in your new position as far as helping them? So I guess what the biggest challenges are for you and the residents of Sonoma County as you go forward.
So, the glass fire is just the last one of, a series of fires over the last 3 years. I mean, we kind of like laugh, cry at the county these days. It started with 2017, October 2017, when Santa Rosa was devastated by the largest urban wildfire in the history of our country. And so in the early stages, in the early hours of October 9th, 2017, a fire kind of came from the east, from Napa County, and was blown by really intense, very fast moving Diablo winds, very hot winds in the middle of really, really difficult conditions, tinderbox conditions in Northern California. And that fire blew through my little town. It crossed 6 lanes of a freeway, and it completely devastated a little subdivision in the middle of town that folks never even imagined would be subject to kind of wildfire threat. That was our first fire. I was the only person in my office, besides our kind of lead county counsel, who was able to make it into the emergency operations center that morning. He had fled through active flames, evacuating his home around midnight, and ended up in the emergency operations center. And I was the second person to follow him. And so, that was kind of our baptism by fire in what is now our reality in California. We are experiencing now what it means for our climate to have irrevocably changed. And so, that was 2017. And there were fires in 2015 and 2016 in Lake County and in kind of neighboring counties around us that we definitely, experienced the smoke and the ash. It's amazing how far ash travels. I never thought that I would know that before. So starting in 2015, all the way through, just this last couple of weeks ago, Sonoma County and our neighboring counties continued to be hit by these just enormously devastating and very difficult wildfires. And so we're an agricultural community, right? It's one of the reasons why I live here and why I moved here, is that this is a community that continues to have, at its core, farm workers who are driving its economy, who are driving the industry that, that is made famous by, wine country and how bucolic and beautiful it is. But still, the core of all of that, the core of this community is farm workers. And so, it was in those early morning hours again of October 9th when I'm in the emergency operations center and I'm thinking, okay, everybody's got a plan. It's command control. Emergency operations is actually kind of a cool place to be. But I'm walking around the emergency operations center and I realize that I'm not hearing Spanish. And it was one of the questions that I asked was like, hey, how are we getting information out to people who speak Spanish, who don't speak English? And, and in those moments, like there was, I think a bunch of people kind of looked at each other and were like, oh no. And the response was, well, can you do it? And I'm like, well, yeah, absolutely, I can do it. And so it was that moment that I moved from being kind of a typical lawyer in an emergency operations center into being the first, Spanish language public information officer for the county of Sonoma. And it's really in that role that, I have experienced our community's, ongoing struggles with disaster. So, while wildfires are raging, we still have farm workers picking grapes. That's a policy decision that's made by people who are elected. I'm not quite an elected official. I'm hired by those elected officials, but I'm going to take it, as a key part of my job that they've hired me to do, to make sure that they hear from that community that typically doesn't get heard. The impacts are of those kinds of policy decisions to put people in emergency, like in mandatory evacuation zones, right? In the middle of a raging wildfire to harvest wine grapes. Like those are some of the challenges that Sonoma County right now is facing. And I find it, again, just so critical for me to rely on what I know and my lived experience to make sure that my elected officials, none of whom grew up in the fields in quite the way that I did, make sure that they center the experiences of those workers in the ways that they plan for emergencies, in the ways that they respond to emergencies. And so, that's my work reality. And then on the home front, right, we have these kids who for months every year are inside with constant filters running, who know all about what an N95 mask is way before the COVID pandemic hit, and who have, it shocks me, it hurts me to think that this is their lives. And I'm also just blown away by the fact that they have just accepted that these are their lives. And so, I was telling a story recently about how, we're in the middle of this crazy fire and the air quality is hazardous outside. And my husband, who's a welder and a painter and an artist, had gone out and gotten all these amazing respirators, right? That are what you use in hazardous working conditions. And he got them to fit my kids' faces. And so my kids were like, hey, can we go outside? And they strapped their respirators on, and they look like they're, you know, kind of astronauts from another planet. And they almost looked like they were stepping into another planet, because it was daylight, or it was daytime, but it looked like Mars, because the sky was orange. And there was so much ash and smoke in the air that the sun couldn't get through. And so it was actually dark. It was an eerie, weird day. And my kids are strapping on their respirators, and they're going to go outside and walk the dog for a little bit. And, you know, that sense of resiliency and kind of acceptance of the new normal in this generation blows me away. It gives me hope, because I think that a lot of people in our community that have lived with this, who are my age, are like, we can't do this anymore. Where are we moving? How are we going to keep dealing with this? And, but I think those are the questions that we should be asking ourselves as a country right now, right? How are we going to really address what is coming? How are we going to adapt in the way that I see my kids adapting? What are the tools, and what are the things, and what are the ways in which we're going to be able to survive and make sure that our planet survives as we continue to deal with, you know, the ravages of what it is that we've done to it. So, you know, that's so much of, I think, of our day-to-day reality that, you know, I see in the news, and I know that is, you know, kind of starting to percolate to the rest of the country, but I think California is just on this bleeding edge right now. And I'm proud and scared and hopeful and worried all at once, and just really honored that this is part of my work, that this is part of what it is that we are tasked to do right now, is to figure out how do we survive these things in a way that is equitable, that takes into consideration the people who are most vulnerable, that really centers the experience of those people who are going to have the hardest time affording respirators and air filters and water filters that we're going to need to put in place, because when you have that much toxic ash that's flowing into your watersheds, something happens to the quality of your water. So those are all the questions that are really, you know, the center of what it is that I do every day, as well as what it is that we live every day in our town right now.
Thank you.
Well, Alegría, as you heard at the beginning from Headmaster Ted Kaskouras, Thayer Academy, like any good school or school community or institution, has been going through a soul-searching process in recent months as the compounding effects of the COVID pandemic and new instances of racial injustice have been, you know, laid bare for everyone to see in all their nonchalant horror. And now the wildfires are going on all around. Other indications of environmental dangers we face. Thayer is trying to, just reassess who we are, relook at some of our guiding principles and so on, and try to figure out how we can become more attuned to all voices in our community, and, you know, heal injuries that may have happened without our being aware or aware enough. And we're just wondering if, from your position as an alum, whose young life and whose whole career has been dedicated to these issues of America's problems with inequality and, you know, the diversity within our society that we don't quite know how to operate with on a day-to-day level in real life. I mean, we have our principles and they say glorious things, but when you get right down to the nitty-gritty of it, we don't always practice what we preach. So from your point of view, we're just wondering if you could express, you know, what you would hope for Thayer in particular, or schools like Thayer, to keep in mind going forward as they go through this, you know, somewhat painful and difficult process, but a very necessary and a very positive one at the same time. You know, what would you hope that we would value about who we have been and try to make progress with in ways that we may have, you know, stumbled or fallen or going forward? What, you know.
That is the question of this time, right? Is how do we do better now that we know better? And, you know, for me, I go back to what my experience was at Thayer. And I, you know, really reflecting on the ways in which, you know, equity is about you have to take into consideration what are the historical, institutional, generational barriers that have been created, whether you created them or not, right? That you have inherited, and that kids, because of who they are, have also inherited all of those things. And so I think about what it was like for me to show up at, you know, on the Thayer campus, the daughter of farm worker organizers who were broke as hell, and, you know, and not know how to even engage in these conversations with people about my life and how different it was. And knowing that there were kids, you know, who were also living lives at Thayer that didn't look like, you know, what the mainstream or what the majority of kids' lives look like at Thayer. And I remember, like, there were moments where we would see each other in deep ways, those kids, those of us. And I remember that there were moments where you saw us. And I really want to celebrate and elevate the ways in which you do that. And you've done that. And you did that for me. So I think about, you know, I told you this, Mrs. Atkinson, you know, there was a morning where I showed up in your class, and I'm sure it was, you know, I was one of the few kids at Thayer who worked nights after practice. And, you know, Rick Philogene and I would head off to South Shore Plaza and sell shoes at night. And that's how I, you know, bought my books at Thayer and helped my mom with my education and made sure that there was food in my fridge and, you know, did all the things that I don't think that most kids at Thayer needed to do. And I didn't know how to talk about those things. And I certainly didn't know how to talk about those things with my teachers or my friends. But there was something about the way in which, you know, you saw me and you made some space for that part of my life and that part of me that was something that I wanted to keep invisible and something that was really hard to talk about or to even identify as, like, this is how different I am. So I walked into your class that day, and, you know, I remember I'd been up the night before. You know, when you work until 11:30 at the mall, then you come home and you do your homework until 1 or 2 in the morning, and then you get up and you do it all over again. And I walked into your class and you took one look at me and you're like, get out, go take a nap, go to my office. And you just, I remember, and you didn't say you're off the hook, kiddo. Like, you said, here are the chapters that we're talking about. I want to make sure that you read them. You tabbed them for me, and then you sent me to your office to take a nap. And, you know, that kindness and that gaze and that moment of a nap let me go on to practice that afternoon and, you know, to continue being the kind of athlete that I wanted to be, that I probably couldn't have been that day without a nap. And, you know, I think about, you know, the size of Thayer and the heart of Thayer allows you to really look at each kid and to have those moments where you think about the questions that you don't know how to ask or answer that come from that kid, and how do you elicit some of that from that kid? I don't remember writing anything of any consequence in your class, Mr. King. I remember that it was a time for me to reflect and think about, you know, what are the words that other writers have used to talk about the most difficult for them, and that touched my heart, and that your class allowed me to, at least for those, like, you know, really sacred moments, to tap into those feelings. You know, Branf, you're gonna make me cry too, because, you know, your pottery studio was the place that I could hide when I needed to not be found or seen in the middle of, whether it was girl drama or boy drama or, you know, whatever it was. That was also just a safe space. And not only that studio underground, but your studio, you know, and you're opening those doors for us to be all of who we were on the weekends and on the afternoons when we needed to really find a place that was going to allow us to be who we are. And to see that and to create those spaces for kids is really magical. I mean, I'm a school board trustee in California in a public school system that is dealing with challenges that Thayer just doesn't have in quite the same ways. And every day, this place, you know, despite how hard it was for me and how hard it was, I think, for other kids who were dealing with similar things like me, is still the gold standard. And I really love this reflection and this moment that you're taking to say, you know, where are those things that we didn't see and that we don't know about? And I wonder, Mrs. Atkinson, I wonder if you remember that moment, you know, and I can imagine that there are so many other moments like that that you've given other kids. And how does that work into a best practices policy manual, right? How do you as an institution understand whether or not it has enough food? And, you know, and if they're safe in, you know, taking public transportation home, and how you facilitate, you know, Kate Gillen, I love you and your parents for always driving us. You know, you guys were the Dorchester-Milton connection for working kids and working class parents. And I just like those connections were organic, but I wonder if there's a way to really institutionalize some of those connections for kids at Thayer to really elevate their ability to tap into some of those resources that a community network provides, to recognize the strength of a community and the assets that, you know, all community members bring to a community instead of understanding them as deficits or as needs. How do those connections strengthen who it is that we are? And, you know, I know that my connections to Rick and to Kate and to those kids who, you know, were not the typical Thayer kid in the way that we understand typical Thayer kid, were so much of the richness of that experience, and the ways in which, you know, your gaze was so loving and so took into consideration, you know, what I needed to have an equitable educational experience at Thayer. And so, you know, that's the policy work, right? Like is to like tease out all of these moments from our experiences and to have these critical conversations with those populations that you don't get to hear from all the time, because these are conversations that are rooted in shame and they're rooted in need and in hardship, and they're hard and they're beautiful. And they, at the core of all of these conversations is the love that we have for this community and for what it means for each of these kids to go on to do and be who they are. And, you know, those people in these places and at Thayer, you know, you did that. And so however you continue to do that, as well as asking yourself the hard questions about what are we not talking about tonight that we still don't know about, that we still have to restore justice about, those that, you know, that's the work, are these, you know, deep sources of connection that make this experience possible, that this experience is a positive experience possible.
Thank you. Thank you. We should transition to the question and answer session at this point. So again, people in the audience, you've already been doing this to some degree, I can see, but I'll read as many questions as time allows. We won't be able to get to everyone, I'm sure, but I believe there's a way to record all of these and pass them on to Alegría, along with the chat script, which is probably very interesting to read, but can't really see more than one thing at once at my age. So anyway, here's a somewhat pace-changing question from our beloved English department head, emeritus, Betty Bailey, who lives part-time in California each year. And she writes, I've heard that the fires, primarily the smoke from the fires, have heard the red wine harvest, but not the white wine harvest. Do you know if this is so and why? Little comic relief here.
You know, Mrs. Bailey, that is such a good question. I have to say that from what I'm experiencing right now around Sonoma County's policies with farm workers working in mandatory evacuation zones, my dad asked me, he sent me a screenshot of a bottle the other day, and he's like, this is a Sonoma County bottle of wine, you know, do you know about it? And I was like, frankly, everything from Sonoma County tastes like scorched farm worker lung. I don't want to drink it right now, you know? And so I don't know about the science between red and white. I do know that, you know, our community as a whole is really struggling with the balance of equities in making sure that our industries are healthy and okay, even in the face of, you know, deep climate change, and that we have a whole lot of responsibility for the people who are still in those fields. So firefighters, when they're working in those hazardous conditions, have all kinds of protective equipment, and they get hazard pay, and they have insane health benefits. And farm workers have none of those things. And so for me, the question is less about the difference between red and white and the difference between brown and white. And why are those disparities still really prevalent? And why are we still having a conversation about, you know, should they be in the fields or not? It's like, okay, let's figure out if they need to be in the fields because the industry needs to keep working because that's the core of our economy, then what are the things that we need to do to make sure that they're safe in those fields? And so it's not so black and white, and it's not such an easy question. I think it really does require us to again center the people in all of these decisions and all of these conversations about how we're going to move forward together. Where we all get to celebrate and drink Sonoma County wine again with some pride and happiness. Sorry, that didn't answer your question. And I miss you. And when can I see you? Because you're here.
Okay, thanks, Betty. Here's a question from Mark Shaloub, class of 95. He's asking, in what ways does California serve as a positive model for other states? And in what ways does it underachieve? Maybe I'll just tack on to this very quickly. Just a couple of days ago, New York Times, I saw a piece about 1,000 Mexican farm workers in Virginia who are virtually imprisoned at the moment, ostensibly to protect the population from their spreading COVID among the Virginia population. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be much protection in place for them to avoid spreading it among themselves, should that be the situation. So they don't have any freedom of movement, and they're caught where they are. So back to Mark's question, do you have a sense that California in some ways is ahead of what other states are doing and how they handle farm worker difficulties?
That's a great question, Mark. So one of the deep challenges in federal law around the protection of workers who have typically been workers of color, right? So home care workers, farm workers, folks who are nannies and house cleaners, is that they have long been excluded from the protections of the National Labor Relations Act. So that's the right of workers to organize into unions. So farm workers and all these, like typically other workers of color, have been carved out of those protections. What California has done specifically with farm work is to create its own state structure of laws. And that's the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which I think it's the coolest law in the whole world, because it takes all the good parts of the NLRA and it was written by the UFW activists. It was, negotiated through Jerry Brown in his first term as governor in the early 70s. And it's a really powerful piece of legislation. So in that way, I think California has kind of addressed some of the ways in which farm workers have been excluded from legal protections by creating its own state statute around the protection of labor rights for farm workers. I would say that it continues to fail because the single largest lobby in California continues to be the agricultural industry. And the reasons why my family ended up in Boston in 1986 was because of the lack of political power in California, and those challenges still exist. So, the political process, who is appointed to be a board member of the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, who is appointed to be, you know, the kind of lead prosecutor of farm worker labor cases. That was me for a little bit until it was way too much. We were pushing way too hard. And you know, and then we started to kind of see our budget dissipate and our political power pull away, and our right to seek, you know, temporary restraining orders in state court on our own as prosecutors under the Agricultural Labor Relations Act fall away. So the political processes in California and the way that ag still controls much of them makes it very difficult for California to really kind of to meet its aspirations in the ways in which its state statute was really grounded in that history and that recognition. So I'd say that, you know, it's a mixed bag, and we have this incredible law on the books. I would say the other ways that California is just significantly failing in comparison to other states is with regard to our public education system. So we have a really heinous state law that essentially pegs property taxes paid to the date that you bought your property, right? So we've got people in Sonoma County who have, you know, estates that could be million something at this point that they may have bought in 1950 something at $40,000, right? And so they're paying the $40,000 tax rate and not the $2.5 million tax rate of what their current property taxes are. And so as a result, our schools are woefully underfunded. And are not in line at all with what other states are doing with regard to funding public education. So I think California is it's such a cool place to live and such a cool place to like watch and see what's happening. And that's just a cool place to be in the mix on all of these things. I think the other amazing thing that California is doing is really leading on greenhouse gas emission reductions at the same time that we're trying to figure out how to deal with all of the incredible wildfire smoke and all the all of the emissions that happen as a result of being on fire for much of the year. So come on out if you want to have some adventures. I'd love to introduce you to any of those areas for people to get involved in. But it's, you know, it really is such a cauldron of so many different things that are happening all at once in one place.
Okay. Alegría, here's a question from John McLennan, class of 1962. John, thanks for being here. You may get the prize for the most years between then and now. John's question is your position in Sonoma elective or appointed? Do you have any aspirations for elective office?
So I'm an appointed department head. So I'm a director of a new department. My department is all of 2.25 people right now. So it's you know, it's tiny, and I'm in startup mode, which is fun during a pandemic and multiple wildfires. The elected office that I do hold is as a trustee for the Sonoma County City Schools Board. So I'm a board member for our largest district, public district of schools in Sonoma County. And, you know, I don't know if I really want to run for office. You know, like in the work that I do right now, I love doing the work. And I don't know how much I would love being a politician that has to answer to all constituents all the time. I love that I get to really champion, you know, my community and to raise up those things that are kind of like in my sphere of what I know to be true and what I hope that others know to be true at some point as well. To really bring to bear those voices into local government is such an awesome job. And I don't necessarily know that I would be able to do it in quite the same way as an elected official with, you know, the way, frankly, that politics are funded. And the way that, you know, so much of this happens on the ground. I probably, if I did run, I might be a one-termer. But we'll see, because our country is also so amazing, where you have, you know, I never thought that AOC would be the force that she is. And, you know, and that there's this whole, and like the squad of these incredible women of color who are fighting, you know, pushing this boulder uphill and who have gotten to the top of it, and we're watching it roll down. Like, so maybe I'm being still kind of, you know, negative about the future of my being in elected office, but I don't love the idea of running a companion. I don't love the idea of being the candidate.
Nor do I. Alegría, here's a question from Kay Keating, and it's a loaded one. Did your family work with Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez?
Yeah. So Dolores has 11 amazing children. Her youngest was born 2 weeks after I was. And so she's one of my closest childhood friends. She is now the executive director of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. I'm a proud board member of that foundation, and Dolores continues to be a total force of nature. So I you know, and she was somebody who was around for my childhood and who I watched as a model for how to be a working mom. And she, I mean, she's just really, she's incredible. Cesar was also, so between campaigns, there was a, you know, the farm workers moved from Delano up into this little kind of mountain community outside, still in Kern County, but up into the Tehachapi Mountains called La Paz. And that's where kind of organizers and the headquarters of the union were situated after we moved out of Delano. We moved out of Delano for lots of good reasons. It was very open. There were constant threats on Cesar's life, on organizers' life, constant bomb threats. It was not a very secure location. So kind of we moved into this little mountain hamlet where kind of farm worker families and the UFW headquarters was located. And so that's where Cesar and his wife and his family lived. And that's where Dolores lived when she wasn't on campaign. And that's where we went home to. So that was the closest thing to home for, you know, a farm worker organizer kid. And, you know, I remember being a kid around Cesar and having, you know, ask me on a pretty regular basis, all right, kiddo, what are you going to do when you grow up? You know, and I was like, dude, I don't know, I'm 8. Like, I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. And he would always kind of go into this like call and response, right? So like, tell me where you came from. You know, who were your grandparents? And I would say they're farm workers, you know, and they're organizers. Okay, and who are your parents? Right? Now they're organizers, right? And there was like the sense of like just making sure that we understood where we came from. And he would say, so what does that mean for you? And I don't know, I'm 8. And so he would say, well, the thing that comes after organizing is law, because, you know, we have to get these things written down, and we have to be the ones who are going to, you know, who are going to make the laws that then we use to enforce those laws for our people. And then we have to be the judges who are deciding those laws. And so I didn't remember that until I started thinking about what I was going to do after college. And then I started like really thinking like, I ended up in Southeast Asia. I was living in Vietnam and in Hong Kong. And when I was living in Vietnam, I was working in community economic development, and I was, you know, working in farm worker communities and with, you know, folks bent over in the fields. And I knew in that moment that my job was not going to be as a, you know, in international development, kind of telling other countries what they needed to do to be stronger economically, but it was to go home to my own community and to go back to where I came from, to take up that mantle of making sure that, you know, I was giving, and I was standing on the shoulders of those people who put me in these places to be and do. And so I remember that was like the moment I was standing in this rice paddy in central Vietnam after kind of organizing a group of people to come out and look at infrastructure needs in the Central Highlands. And I was like, I need to go home. And that was because of Cesar. And so, you know, both of those incredible leaders, as well as so many others, really shaped the way that I think that we all grew up, and that we all see, you know, our world as being ours, to do something with and for.
Okay, Alegría and everyone, this will have to be our last question. I'm sorry, that means we will not get to all of the questions that have come in from the audience, and I apologize for that. But this question is from Michael Powers. Alegría, growing up, did you speak Spanish at home? Did you experience any ill will from others because of that? And if you did speak Spanish at home, could you articulate how many of us who grew up only speaking English could perhaps appreciate how much more insight into life having both languages was for you? Yeah.
So it's a funny story why I grew up speaking Spanish. So my dad is Chicano, right? He's a Mexican-American, second generation. My mom's white. And I remember being a kid and you know, my parents arguing about it. My dad was like, I don't want my kids to go through what I went through. I don't want them to be treated the way that I was treated. So my dad, you know, ended up sharing with me what it was like for him to be in school as a farm worker, Spanish speaking kid, and that he was put in classes for kids who had learning disabilities, even though he didn't have learning disabilities, just because he's a Spanish speaker. And that really kind of indelibly marked him. And he, remember, was fighting with my mom about, like, I don't want my kids to go through that. And my mom was like, you know, this white lady was a fluent Spanish speaker, probably better grammatically than my dad was, because she was trained in it and educated in it. And she's like, Bobby, this is such a gift for our kids to be able to walk through multiple worlds. And I want them to be proud of who they are. And I want them to know that this is like another power that they have, and that will open doors. And so it's actually because of my white mama that I grew up speaking Spanish. And my dad went along with it. He was like, okay, fine. My white mama was always a little bit of an anomaly in our communities. And so he was like, all right, another one of your crazy ideas. I mean, we were also like vegetarians and didn't eat processed food and all this other stuff because of my awesome white mama. And so, so that, you know, and I think the funny thing that happened when we moved to Boston, so there weren't any Mexicans in Boston when we moved to Boston. Like, you couldn't buy tortillas in the grocery store. I remember being like, why can't you buy tortillas? Like, and there was no Mexican food in Boston. And there was like one place in Jamaica Plain. And I remember my dad getting really mad that they charged you extra if you ordered more tortillas, which never happens in California. Come and eat Mexican food in California. And so, you know, we'd go shopping in the supermarket, and my mom, you know, would speak to us in Spanish because that's what she always did. And so we'd be in the supermarket, and, you know, she'd be telling us to do this or do that in the supermarket. And people would literally just like turn around and stare at us like, what is going on here? Like, you look Italian, or you're not Italian. You don't look Dominican. You don't look Puerto Rican. She's white. You're not. And so I just remember people being really confused for most of our time in Boston when we were speaking Spanish. And then, you know, and it took me a long time to, I think when I came into school as a Spanish speaker, I remember asking my mom, like, why do I have to know 2 words for everything? And everybody else only needs to know 1 word, you know, and her telling me like, this is actually, that's cool. Like, that's a superpower. That was part of like her, right? Like, saying this is such a cool thing to have. But it took me a long time to respond to her in Spanish. And so I remember losing my speaking ability back to her. And I understood Spanish for a long time, but I lost my fluency in being able to push it back out. And it was a part of, you know, that whole process of coming home to California and working in my community and working as a lawyer in my community, that my Spanish unlocked in my brain again. And I would just say that so much of what is, you know, what my mom brought to that conversation about how proud to be of our language and how amazing it is to speak another language. And also, like, the rest of the world is multilingual. And we in the United States have some bizarre reason for not wanting our kids to be multilingual. And that is going to put us all at a disadvantage at some point in the future. And so, you know, I remember loving Thayer and talking to my kids now, you know, as a school board member, about how critical learning and teaching Latin is, right? Like, go Mr. Earl. Like, who knew that, you know, 9th grade Latin was going to be so formative and foundational to my being, you know, a good reader and a good writer and all these other things. And so I think it's so important for us to really celebrate people speaking other languages. And hopefully you don't look at them, you know, when they're speaking other languages, like, what the heck is going on with you and your family? But maybe to be curious and maybe to figure out, how do you pick up another language as a grown-up? It's really hard. You know, and what are the languages that are spoken in our community as a whole at Thayer, right? How many languages are spoken at Thayer? And I think those are all just such cool questions to ask and answer with curiosity and love and pride.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Alegría, for all of that. Lots and lots to think about and feel. Thank you. And I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank, again, Mr. Kaskouras and all the folks in the Alumni Development Office who helped put this together, all the IT people behind the scenes who made it all happen, and to everyone in the audience who took the time and interest to be here and contribute. So thank you so much to everyone. Norma, you want to say anything?
I would just echo everything you've said. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. As I said, it's just always great to have former students come back and teach you. I love it.
Amen. Amen.